Welcome to the 17th Annual International Public Policy Forum Semifinal Debate Number 1. My name is Andrea Sadberry, and I'm the IPPF Executive Director. Founded in 2001, the IPPF is the first and only debate contest that gives students across the world the opportunity to engage in written and oral debates on issues of public policy. The competition is sponsored by the Brewer Foundation and New York University. This year, more than 160 teams representing schools in 17 countries and 30 U.S. states submitted qualifying round essays on the topic Resolved. International Climate Accords for Greenhouse Gas Emissions should adopt binding enforcement mechanisms. Judges determined the top 64 teams who entered into a single elimination written debate tournament, involving papers back and forth via email. The process continued for several rounds until the Elite 8 teams were named. Those 8 teams are with us this weekend in New York. The quarterfinals debates just ended, and at this time we will begin with our first semifinal debate between William Mason High School from Mason, Ohio, competing against Concordia International School from Shanghai, China. At this time, I'd like to invite our debaters to introduce themselves.
My name's Otnay. I'm a senior and I'm from Mason, Ohio.
My name is Suraj. I'm a senior and I'm from Mason, Ohio.
My name is Rahul Ramesh. I'm a senior and unsurprisingly I'm also from Mason, Ohio.
My name is Christy and I'm a sophomore from Concordia International School.
My name is Isabella and I'm also a sophomore.
I'm Evelyn and I am a sophomore as well.
Let's go ahead and give these students a big round of applause. Well, now to introduce our moderator and our judges. Serving as our moderator for this debate is Mr. David Baker. Mr. Baker is Director of Admissions at St. Mark's School of Texas in Dallas. Prior to that, he coached debate and taught public speaking for 16 years. Mr. Baker worked with the law firm of Brewer Attorneys and Counselors to develop this international contest and currently leads the IPPF's Topic Selection Committee. Our semifinal judges include Ms. Gloria Zhang, who's a sophomore at New York University pursuing a double major in finance and philosophy. As a member of the NYU policy debate team, she won multiple awards at tournaments, including a JV regional championship at Monmouth University. In 2017, Ms. Zhang advanced to the finals of the Novice National Championships, losing a 2-1 decision to place second in the nation. This year, she served as vice president of the team's e-board and as the NYU IPPF liaison. She was recently elected to serve as the NYU debate team's president for the 2018-19 season. Mr. Trey Smith is the New Mexico District Chair of the National Speech and Debate Association and the Executive Director of the East Mountain High School Foundation. He's coached multiple teams to the Elite 8 rounds of the IPPF and currently serves on the IPPF Advisory Board. A 2-diamond coach with the NSDA, Mr. Smith has coached over 60 students to the national tournament, including multiple national finalists and the 2012 National Student of the Year. In 2015, Mr. Smith was named the Outstanding Speech, Debate, and Theater Educator for Section 6 by the National Federation of High Schools. In 2020, Mr. Smith will serve as the host for the NSDA National Tournament in Albuquerque. And Mr. Noel Salesi. He is currently the Vice President for Institutional Advancement at Don Bosco Preparatory High School and has coached debate at Hunter College High School for over 25 years. He also helped found the International Debate Education Association and for many years directed the Open Society Foundation's Network Debate Program. A graduate of Amherst College and Columbia University, he's helped establish debate programs in over 40 countries around the world. Mr. Salesi is also a member of the IPPF Advisory Board. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our judges and moderator. Finally, a quick reminder to please turn off or silence your cell phones. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. David Baker, who will explain the rules of the competition.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for all the work you do to get us to this place. I think everybody in the room has probably had multiple conversations with Andrea over the course of all of the time and the effort that it takes to get us here. I have a little more insight on that because I bother her more than the rest of you, and so I get the scoop. But she is the glue that holds this entire contest together, and I'd like to thank her as well. Andrea. I think everyone's aware of the format. My job is to stay out of the way, and I'm not very good at that job, so I'll do the best I can. You guys do the best you can. I'm going to operate under the assumption that everyone here has some sort of timekeeping technology and that you'll be watching that yourselves, so I'm not going to be calling out signals or doing anything along those lines. What I am going to be fairly rigid about is the requirements and the specific rules concerning cross-examinations, and I'll ask our panel to be careful with this as well, is that I don't want one person on each team sort of dominating the questioning and answering, right? We're going to spread that out. The team captains will do that, whoever is the captain of each side, like for somebody on each team to be in charge of that, right? The rules state that during the questioning period, everybody has to ask a question, everybody has to answer a question. So if the captains will kind of direct those questions where they want them to go, that's fine. And then when the panel starts to ask questions, you can ask those questions of anyone you like, but keep in mind that we'd like to spread it around. And that's sometimes those result in follow-ups and stuff. And I'm not keeping a exact accounting of who has how many minutes, but we'll let that be as organic as we possibly can and try to be fair to both sides. So any questions about anything at that point? Because hopefully you're not going to hear much more from me. All right? Okay, we will start with the affirmative constructive speech, which is an 8-minute speech, and you may start when you're ready.
Right. Let's begin. William Mason affirms the resolution. Resolved. International climate accords for greenhouse gas emissions should adopt binding enforcement mechanisms. We observe the resolution states climate treaties should adopt BEMs. Cambridge English Dictionary defines adopt as to accept or begin to use something. This means that the resolution is referring to accepting or beginning to use BEMs on pre-existing accords. This is important because if the negative wants to make arguments about participation, they have to explain why countries will leave status quo accords that they have already signed on to, not just why countries won't sign on to accords. The affirmative argues that countries have a fundamentally different calculus for leaving accords than for choosing not to sign them. This is for two main reasons. First, because countries look perceptually poorer when they leave an accord that they have already made a commitment to. Secondarily, countries are unlikely to leave accords as they feel as if they have already sunk costs, time, and political capital into it. Thus, affirmative arguments about non-participation must link through countries leaving, not through countries joining. We secondarily observe, as explained by Ulay, enforcement mechanisms fall into two categories, positive and negative. The affirmative postulates that the most important and pertinent issue in the matter of climate accords is the issue of compliance, or the following of guidelines and goals. This is problematic because compliance in status quo commitments is disastrously low. Guri Bang explains, while Paris scores high on participation and reasonably high on depth of parties' commitments, its Achilles heel will be compliance. Concerning long-term effectiveness, Paris does little to restructure states' incentives so as to avoid free riding. It might end up as a failure. Fortunately, Ulay explains, enforcement mechanisms should be understood as those methods by which negotiators can encourage compliance. There are 5 reasons why binding enforcement mechanisms increase compliance in climate accords. First, BEMs tangibly incentivize compliance in currently non-complying nations by establishing hard incentives. In the status quo, there are no binding tangible consequences for failing to comply with accords. The opposite is true in the affirmative world. This is important because, as Jana von Stein explains, while governments' motivations in using international inducements are diverse, the inducements themselves rely on a cost-benefit logic. Thus, in order to induce compliance, countries must feel as if there is a hard incentive to do so, something that is exclusive to the affirmative world. Second, binding enforcement mechanisms increase the inherent ability of states to comply in climate accords. In the status quo, countries face structural barriers to meeting goals and guidelines. There are 2 interior warrants as to how BEMs solve. First, climate accords assist poor developing nations. Barrett explains that climate accords can create positive incentives for developing countries to participate, compensating developing countries for their compliance costs, using financing to get developing countries onto a carbon-free development path. Second, BEMs spur the development of green technologies. Jacker of NYU furthers that in accords with enforcement mechanisms, private investors of industrialized countries finance GHG emission reduction projects in developing countries parties to the accord, receiving low carbon technology. Overall, if states are more able to comply in climate accords, they will be more likely to do so. Thirdly, binding enforcement mechanisms strengthen and promote soft incentives for compliance that exist in the status quo. Currently, the only thing that pushes compliance in the status quo is non-tangible incentives such as perception and the following of norms. There are 2 interior warrants as to why enforcement mechanisms reinforce and further these pre-existing incentives. First, because however poorly countries look now, when not meeting climate goals, they would be looked upon even worse when they continue to non-comply when it is easier and more advantageous to do so. Second, BEMs would better allow nation-states and the general public to monitor and check on countries' progress. Plumer of the New York Times explains, right now, many of the Paris pledges remain fairly opaque, and most nations have been vague on what specific policies they will take to meet them. There's no official mechanism for quantifying progress. Fourth, binding enforcement mechanisms create a culture of compliance referred to as a race to the top, which Bang defines as a, quote, snowball effect. Bang clarifies, once key countries make first steps towards cutting their emissions, others will follow suit. However, Volterra Fietta explains that in the status quo, a race to the top is skeptical due to the lack of consequences in compliance mechanisms of the status quo, leading to the ability of countries to wiggle out of commitments. In contrast, in the affirmative world, countries are incentivized to take the first step, leading to a ratcheting effect as other countries follow. Fifth, enforcement mechanisms increase voluntary compliance. Yang explains, enforcement affirms commitment and protects the continued existence of the community for the benefit of all. Protecting and preserving normative communities can have long-term transformational benefits. If norms, interests, and identities of community members are preserved or more closely aligned with overall treaty goals and purposes, voluntary compliance will improve, and punitive corrective actions may be less necessary. The impact of compliance is massive. Compliance in climate accords is a necessity to actively mitigate climate change. Bang explains, to make a real difference for curbing climate change, agreements must achieve high compliance rates. But even more importantly, even if compliance isn't increased, there's intrinsic worth to the enforcement mechanisms themselves. Yang explains, compliance is not the sole criterion for assessing the usefulness of traditional enforcement mechanisms. Even in domestic legal systems, the use of deterrent sanctions does not achieve perfect compliance. A complete understanding of treaty enforcement must also consider its expressive function. Yang explains two unique impacts of enforcement. First, he explains that enforcement is a necessity for global community to set long-standing norms on the issue, as well as sending a strong signal of cooperation and moral obligation. He states, if a treaty can be seen as the expression of a consensus on norms, enforcement actions are necessary to affirm the existence of a common normative community to which all treaty parties belong. Unlike a morally neutral disincentive, such as a tax, sanctions signal disapproval and denounce the non-conforming act. They express the significance of the institution's concern with the norm violation, that the other parties actually, quote, care about the treaty norms and their breach. Secondly, Yang explains that enforcing one treaty creates a precedent that emphasizes and strengthens the rule of law and compliance in other treaties. Quote, in addition to strengthening particular substantive norms, enforcement also promotes a more general norm, the rule of law, because of its significance as a norm that is not only present in all treaties, but also independently in international law more generally. The rule of law warrants separate treatment. And this is crucial because international law dictates actions for countries all over the world for treaties that deal with a multitude of actions. And that's going to become crucial later on. And thus, we as the affirmative are proud to affirm.
Thank you. We will now have the opening speech from the negative for a period of 8 minutes. Whenever you're ready.
Judges ready? The global temperature will rise an alarming 2.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century. According to Joeri Rogel, lead researcher with the International Institute for Applied System Analysis in Austria, the window for limiting warming to below 1.5 Celsius with high probability already seems to have closed. Even if all emissions from fossil fuel burning is stopped, climate change will continue on for centuries, which means every little contribution is needed to slow down climate change. Good morning, I am the first speaker of the negative. According to Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the social contract theory states that through means of mutual reflection, choice, and logical agreement, all parties are subject to collectively enforce a social arrangement or contract which is legitimate, obligating, and rationally justified. Similar to this is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, a philosopher who studies in the on the social contract theory. The process by which a general contractual rule or agreement is deemed morally sound upon consideration is if supposing parties enacting this rule, each member and the result itself maintains the universal moral integrity, never treating anything as a means but as a mutually desirable end. In other words, there are intrinsic and extrinsic aspects of the social contract theory applicable to non-binding agreements. Countries are pulling together. They may not be at the same level in terms of equity, but they are buying and pulling in together. When applied to the resolution, all countries should collectively participate towards a common cause, slowing down climate change. Only non-binding enforcement mechanisms can achieve this. The negative would like to define a few terms below. Non-binding agreements can be defined as any agreement that does not contain BEMs and offers flexibility, economic benefits, and compliance. Participation is ratifying an agreement and following through pledges to the best of their ability. International means affecting most, if not all countries, meaning that every single party in an agreement matters. Only non-binding agreements can achieve this form of international unity. The negative would also like to clarify that, according to law professor Daniel Budansky, enforcement is not a necessary condition for an instrument to be legally binding. Therefore, the affirmative needs to prove that binding enforcement mechanisms uniquely improve the effectiveness of an agreement. The contentions for first speech are, first, non-BEM agreements increase participation. Second, all BEMs require a state's consent, making them ineffective. And third, non-binding enforcement mechanisms agreements increase compliance. And the second speaker will elaborate on the fourth and fifth, which are BEMs damage countries' economies and BEMs are ineffective due to the nature of international law. Non-binding agreements encourage participation from all countries. The U.S. chief negotiator in the Paris Agreement, Todd Stern, explained, allowing parties to set their own emission targets was intended to encourage broad participation among states and incentivize maximum ambition. This contributes to real-life emission reductions. The only way to get 195 countries to sign the Paris Agreement was to abolish BEMs. According to The Independent, when the Paris Agreement was in its negotiating stage in 2015, countries such as the US and China would have refused to join if it were binding. The carbon emissions of China and the US totals an alarming 45%. If they were not a party to Paris and continued to emit without control, then nearly half of the greenhouse gas emissions would not be controlled, making Paris ineffective if it used BEMs. Thus, participation is a key to this debate and slowing down climate change. On to our next contention. Compliance depends on a state's consent. According to the Earth Institute of Columbia University, international law takes effect only through the actions of individual sovereign states. BEMs cannot force countries to comply to it because international law is soft. When Canada withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol in 2009 to avoid a fine of 14 billion Canadian dollars, no consequences were made despite it being under a BEM agreement. This falsifies the affirmative's romanticized world, in which every single country will comply to BEMs despite it having domestic and economic priorities. In a 2011 study of climate diplomacy, David Victor of the UC San Diego concluded, the very attributes that made targets so attractive to environmentalists, that they set binding goals, made the Kyoto Treaty brittle because countries that couldn't honor their commitments had few options but to exit. China is one country that is investing greatly in green energy. However, the negative would like to state that this is not due to the presence of binding enforcement mechanisms in any agreement. Rather, they are doing this without any binding enforcement mechanism forcing them to do. They are doing this due to the domestic and social pressures and interests. For example, according to Greenspace, China is now aggressively investing in non-electric chillers and natural gas to cool the air rather than traditional air conditioning systems that trap heat and deplete the ozone layer. If the United States and other European Union countries adopted the same wide-scale measures, the universal environmental effect would significantly decrease the rate by which the ozone layer is being depleted. According to Greenspace, China installs an entire soccer field's worth of solar panels and erects a new wind turbine almost every hour. In addition, the Chinese government has declared the intention to ban all fossil fuel-powered vehicles in the future. There will never be a BEM that is strong enough to override the will of a domestic government. Therefore, BEMs are ineffective and weak in an international climate agreement. My third contention is non-binding agreements increase compliance through social pressure. Compliance is vital to an agreement. However, to increase compliance, binding mechanisms have to be constantly enforced. Although other government agents can enforce binding laws in individual countries, there are no international police to enforce policies on a global scale. This shows that binding enforcement mechanisms are not an efficient way to increase a nation's compliance. The U.S. Department of State says that in a non-binding instrument, a country is punished through damage to its reputation. This is a more effective damage as it does not cross with the economy but affects diplomatic relations. Countries must accept commitments willingly instead of being forced by sanctions. According to Canadian Environment Minister Peter Kent, if Canada has to meet the Kyoto targets in 2012, it would require removing every motor vehicle from the roads and turning off heat in every house. This shows that Canada was unwilling to comply to the unreasonable targets in Kyoto. According to Michael Berger of the Columbia Law School, most international agreements rely on the country's desire to continue having good relationships with their counterparts rather than BEMs. For example, during the 2014 Lima Agreement, former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott has loudly pledged not to give a single cent to the Green Climate Fund, and as a result, Australian diplomats received cold shoulders from their international counterparts at the Lima Agreement meeting 2 weeks later. This caused Australia to contribute $200 million to the fund, and it was contributing to be a good international citizen. The negative reiterates its theory of social contract and cosmopolitanism, and therefore, we firmly negate this resolution. Thank you.